Without further ado, I want to get started talking about Python and Excel. I've prepared a couple of demos today that hopefully share a little bit about what Python and Excel means and provide maybe a slightly different lens on just how deeply integrated it is. And yeah, I just wanted to say I'm super excited to be here today. So thanks for having me, and let's get started. So for my first bit, I'm just going to start with a blank workbook. You can get access today if you're a part of the Insiders beta channel. And the way that you can tell is a few ways, and that's a great segue into the first set of demos I want to give. So first and foremost, if you go to the Formulas tab, it should just be lit up right here. So you should see a chunk that says Python Preview, and then there's a bunch of Python-related stuff. I've already accepted the opt-in that you have to do. So when you go to launch Python the first time, you have to start a trial. I've already done that, so I'm not going to get a prompt. But if you do get it, you'll probably want to try out some of the Python samples. And part of why I'm directing you here is me, like probably many of you, I'm still learning Python even as we develop this thing. Python wasn't my first choice of a programming language, and this is a great way to really get started and kind of see some examples of things that you can do. So within this, it's pretty cool because we've got a bunch of what we feel are pretty common practices of things that you might want to do within Python, but now you can do it in Excel. So it's really easy to get started. You can just simply click Insert Sample, and bada bing, bada boom, you're going to get a whole bunch of data that's just put into the grid. Right now, you can see Python's actually connecting to the cloud. It's taken this data. We've got a bunch of code that's displayed right here, and that's what's powering the chart in front of us. So with a few clicks, I was able to connect these two worlds together pretty seamlessly, and we hope you can try out the samples and let us know what you think. I'll probably say that a bunch today, so heads up on that one. But yeah, that was kind of the first thing I wanted to talk about was it's generally available in Insiders Beta, and if you want to, you can try out the samples. Now, obviously, I have my own set of samples and demos that we're going to walk through today. As you can see, we've got a standard spreadsheet. I've got some stuff that's filled out. We're going to work on this together, and by the end of this, we'll have generated an ETS forecast for some sample data that we have set up. The first way that you can get started with this is by typing =py. So that's one entry point. And that's the first thing I want to talk about is entry points. So if you go to Excel, just like any other Excel function, you call it the same way. You can type =py. You'll get this new entry that says creates Python formulas. And if I hit tab, you'll notice that a whole bunch of stuff just happened in front of us that's different from when you author more normal Excel formulas. In particular, you'll see this PY, and we've got some green badging is the term that we use here. The other thing that I like to highlight here is we are bridging the gap between Python and Excel. So one thing we care deeply about is making it a good experience for people who are familiar with both worlds. And in particular, what I mean by that is if you're used to writing Python, you might be using Jupyter Notebooks or VS Code or Jupyter inside of VS Code or a whole bunch of other standard programming tools. And so we're aware of the common practices and things that happen there, but we're also aware of the habituation and the learning you might have from using Excel formulas. So all that's to say, you're going to notice some custom things that we're trying out and changing within the product. And I'd love to hear feedback on kind of what's working for you, what you wish we would tweak, what sort of bumps you're running into. So having said that, when I type =py, you'll notice that I'm now authoring some Python code that's contained in a cell. But if I wanted to, I can actually hit Control F2. Now I've actually switched to the formula bar, which is my favorite place to author Python code. But let's go ahead and do our first bit of Python code. The first thing that I'm going to do here is actually import a bunch of libraries. Libraries are really important in the Python world because this is how you get access to all the great data science functionality. And so what we've done here is import some standard libraries. And then the last call that we have here is Python libraries loaded successfully. This is just kind of a placeholder to let us know that the code executed correctly. Otherwise, we would get an error. Second thing to call out is when you enter formulas, it's slightly different when you're authoring Python code. In particular, you have to hit Control Enter. So you might see the tooltip on my screen. You might not have noticed it. It might have been something you just turned blinders on to, but you'll want to get used to that. And again, this is something that we're actively looking for feedback on. Is that right? Do you want to customize it? Would you rather something else? But anyway, I'll hit Control Enter. You'll notice we got a pound busy, and boom, we just executed our first bit of Python functionality. So our Python library is loaded successfully. You'll notice that this is a data type given the icon, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit on how you can change the way that output works. So having said that, we've imported some libraries. Now we want to make use of some data. This is, for me, I think one of the most interesting things when you think about the world of Python and Excel that's unique with the offering that we have. When I think about other places where you would go use Python, if you want to interact with Excel, you're going to use some sort of library, you're going to load a workbook. It's not going to be something that is just baked in. And so this is where things get interesting, is the import of data and access of it. Because this is Excel and we have Python here, I can just reference stuff from my grid. So in order to do that, I'm actually going to use the second method by which you can insert a Python formula. And that is if you go over to the Formulas tab, you can click Insert Python, click the dropdown, and then click Python in Excel, and that'll stick you into the Python editor. So now that I'm here, if I want to reference my data, I can simply just click. So I'm going to call this df. If you aren't familiar with Python, df is used a lot kind of as a placeholder variable name because it stands for data frame. And that's an important concept to become familiar with as you learn about Python. And I guess one of the ways you can think about it is a data frame is kind of like just a 2D structure or a table if you're used to Excel. So really it's just your 2D structure that you're going to be using to do a lot of operations. And so now that I've got that, I'm going to reference the data in the grid. So it becomes pretty simple. Now I'm going to use my keyboard because it makes it a lot easier to select stuff. And so just like that, I've created a cell reference. But again, this is totally unique to what you can do in Excel. You'll notice that we have the foils that you're familiar with, and Excel even wrote the Python function for me that pulls that data in. So I can go ahead and commit that, and you'll notice that just like that, we got a result back. And so this time we're seeing the name data frame here. So what's cool about this being data types, if you're familiar with those, I'm going to talk a fair amount about those today, is that now I can actually get a preview of my data. So if I click this, I'm going to see a card. Now this is cool because I can see really quickly, just get an overview of my data, and I can see that indeed we did pull in 145 rows. And if we look at the data, you'll notice that there's something that's maybe going a little bit wrong here. And that is that we have dates and passengers. And we probably want those to actually be promoted as headers. So there's one other thing you'll have to get familiar with as you're working here, and I'll reveal that in a second. But having said that, if I want to continue on with my journey, let's do some data analysis. We've got some data imported into Python land. Let's build a chart. Visualizations are great. Big tables of data are good too, but I'm a visualization guy, and I like to kind of get a bigger picture of things. So for this third instance of authoring Python, I'm actually going to use a keyboard shortcut, which is the one that I use most of the time and will be using as I demo things today from this point forward. And that is Control-Alt-Shift-P. I know it's a bit of a mouthful, but I can hit that and you'll notice that I'm now in Python mode, and I'm actually editing in the formula bar, which is another slight change. We're trying to really determine what the purpose of these surfaces are and curate them and make them unique for their own special offering. So again, another area where we're looking for feedback and interesting in what works and doesn't work for you. So let's go ahead and do some modeling and create a plot. So what I'm doing here is I'm actually going to create a multi-plot, and this is a seasonal decomposition. And what we're pulling in here, if we look at the code, is we've got our data frame, and we're saying we want to pull in the passengers. Because the data that we actually have, if we take a look at it, so I'll commit this, the data that we have is actually dates and passengers. So that's what we're going to model on today. And you'll notice that within each row, there's just 2 bits of information. One is for that month, how many passengers were there? And 2 is what was the month of that date. And so we've got 144 rows of that. And that's what we're going to try to see what sort of seasonality we can find. And then furthermore, how can we forecast what this might look like in the future? Now, having said that, we've got the data, but we're receiving an error here, which brings me to my next click stop. So when you get errors in Python, it's a little bit interesting because we've got 2 places you can reveal them. The first is from the green triangle. If you just click Show Error Message, you'll notice that you get an error here. And so this is telling me key error passengers. And I know how to fix that, so we'll fix that in a second. But you can also go over to the diagnostics pane. So if you hit formulas, you can click diagnostics. There's a handy entry at the bottom, which I personally have turned off because I've been working with this a bunch and I know about this feature, but This allows you to automatically pop this pane whenever you get an error. The other interesting thing is if you ever have a print statement, you might be wondering, where does the print statement go? The print statements go here as well. So having said that, we can see again that we've got a key error passengers, and it's happening in cell C5. And the reason for this is because if we look at our data frame, as I said earlier, the dates and passengers are not actually the headers. So it doesn't really, it's going, where's the passengers column? It's not here. And that's because we need to promote this to a header. And so in order to do that, you can simply just add one more parameter here, and you're going to want to type headers equals true. You'll also notice that autocomplete kicks in here. So this is, again, one of the areas we're trying to improve upon. We know that it's a new language, and you're always going to be looking for autocomplete to kind of help you along your journey. So you'll see that pop up in a number of places today as it is right now. So I'll commit that. We'll see that we get a data frame. Now I'm still getting an error here, and that's because I have manual calc on. And so with Python, there's going to be a couple things you want to get familiar with, and another one of those is within calculation options. And so I have manual because if I were to keep it on automatic, what would happen is it would trigger a recalc to the server, and I'm doing some expensive operations, and I don't necessarily want to do that. So in the future, I'll probably change this to partial, but for now, we're going to keep it on manual. And if I want to recalc, I can simply just hit F9, and we should get a plot back. And just like that, we're seeing another data type with an image. So I can kind of get a preview of this. And your first reaction might be, cool, we got a chart, but it's contained in this card. I kind of want to look at the visual. And that brings me to another point, which is how we handle the different values that actually come back from Python in Excel. So if you look up here in the formula bar, those of you who are pretty astute might have noticed that this looks a little different. Where'd that FX option go? Well, that's because we've introduced a new option here, which lets you switch the Python output. And so some of you might be wondering, okay, why do I need to choose a Python output? What's the point of that? And the reason for that is because when there's values in Python, there isn't always the best approximation in Excel, right? Like, for example, what would a function be inside of Excel? Well, maybe it turns itself into a function. What would a class be? We're starting to get into object orientation territory that maybe Excel's not the best with. And that's why Python objects is pretty valuable here, because it gives you access to the data on the server in an encapsulated manner, kind of like I have here, where it's an image, I can click on it. But in this case, I actually don't want that. I want to convert this into an Excel value. And so what that means is Excel is going to do its best job to pick the most native value that we have. So for example, if you have one of those data frames, it'll turn itself into a dynamic array. If you have an image or a chart, it'll display itself as an image in a cell. And if you've got something like a string, well, it'll turn it into a text value in Excel. So in that case, I'm going to click Excel value, and you'll notice that now we actually get back our chart. I'm going to clear out the diagnostics because we don't need this anymore. And I want to talk a little bit about what we're seeing in this chart, because this is pretty cool. So with 2 lines of code, I was able to generate a multi-plot that gives us some interesting information about the data we have. So on the x-axis, you can see that we've got all these numbers. What do those mean? Well, those are months, because we had individual months, and there's 144 of them. And then on the y-axis, we can see passengers. That's interesting because if we look at each of these charts, and this one's kind of an aggregate of all of them, this tells us some interesting insights about our data. The first, that probably goes without saying, is the trend shows us a trend. And what does that trend look like? Well, it looks like there's more passengers traveling over time. Seasonal, what does this do? Well, it determines seasonality. So you'll notice that there's actually a pattern with the different months. We can see that there reaches kind of an apex at a specific portion of the year. There's a whole bunch of people traveling, and then really quickly it drops down and then goes back again. So we can see some seasonality in the data. And the last thing is this res ID. And what this does is it tells you where there's, you can kind of think of it like confidence within your data. So it implies different trends within the seasonal components. And essentially you want this to be close to the 0 line here. If it's really like all over the place, that means you probably shouldn't trust the data as much. And so we can see actually here in the middle, we've got some pretty high confidence here. And all in all, we've been able to generate that plot and generate some insights with just a few lines of code. So that's cool. We've got our data imported. We've made a plot. We've got some sort of an idea on what's going on here. I said that we were going to forecast things. So how do we do that? Well, for this next bit, we first need to make an ETS model. So we will go back into Python mode, and we'll write our next lines of code. And so what we're going to do here is we're using exponential smoothing, and I'm going to refer to the individual cells so that we can build different scenarios and then hopefully make use of the upfront work that we do. And so if you look at the exponential smoothing, what's going on here, the first thing we do is we take in passengers and we're saying, hey, we want to look at passengers. So that's what we're doing here. Then seasonal periods refers to what is the length of the period. In this case, we're saying 30 days because we want to inspect things by a monthly basis. Then there's the trend, which is multiplicative. So this means that the trend will be scaled by a factor that can potentially change over time. Seasonal, we want to use additive in this case because that means that the seasonal pattern will be added to other components. And then Boxcox says use Boxcox transformations for this data. And then finally, we want to estimate the data here and then fit it. So a whole bunch of stuff. You don't necessarily have to follow along with all that. At the end of this, what we'll end up getting is a model that we can then use to forecast. So if I commit this, we get something back called the Holt-Winters result wrapper. And so this is a common technique used for time series forecasting because we're looking at time today. Cool. So we've got our new model. And this is actually another great example. I'll pause here to talk about the different modes because, again, what would a Holt-Winters result wrapper be in Excel? It's a model. How would you necessarily represent that? Well, with the Python objects, we have a great way of doing that. So let's forecast some data. In this case, I'm going to go straight into the editor, but I'm actually going to hit F2 because if I hit F2, then I can really quickly arrow and access data. And so in this case, I want to select that prior cell that we had. And I'm just going to type forecast. And then I know that this function takes one parameter, and that is the periods, which is what I have above. So we're going to say we want 24 periods or 24 sections of data at about a monthly basis on 30 days. Boom, just like that, I get another result, and we get some series data back. Now, this is cool. We can see a bunch of data. We can see that maybe population will grow, maybe there's some seasonality, but again, this is where a plot is pretty useful. And so for the final bit, at least with this section of the analysis, I'll go over here to create a plot. Again, this is pretty easy. I don't have to go and use insert chart or anything. I can simply just go to that data, do dot plot, hit enter, and then I get a result back, and I can visualize what's going on here. And so again, I don't like this in the image mode, but in this case, I'm actually going to use a different keyboard shortcut that I wanted to highlight for switching the way that the Python objects are output. And so for this, I'm going to use something called Control-Alt-Shift-M. So if I hit that one, you'll notice that now it's switched the mode for me. The icon's changed up here, and I'm getting that image in a cell now. And this is cool. We've now got a forecast of data that we can look at, and we can see that it's basically telling us that we'll probably see the same seasonality, and we can expect the trend to continue over time, at least with this scenario. So what if I wanted to do a whole bunch of other scenarios? This is, for me, another exciting moment of adding Python to Excel, because now I can do Excel stuff with Python code. And what that means is I can do things like fill down or fill right. So in this case, I'll shift over and I'm going to hit Control R. And you'll notice that we got new results, but there's an issue here. We are seeing the same chart, and we're definitely referring to different variables here, right? Because Excel does its range adjust and all that magical stuff. Now, why is that? So the reason for this is because, as I mentioned before, I'm messing with the different calculation options. And I've got it on manual. And so I actually want to switch it to partial in this case, because what Excel will do is it'll figure out what it needs to recalc. And in this case, it'll recalc these two items for me. And now I can see those different results. So this is also interesting because in this one, we've got a 6-day period on this. And so this data, I don't know that I actually trust as much. This one's interesting because if we look at things split on a basically half-month basis, we see almost another similar trend, but it actually looks like it's just forecasting straight up, and there's not nearly as many dips as there are in this one. So that's what I had to talk about in regard to this scenario. Hopefully that was generally interesting and you've seen some of the power of Excel and Python. I'm actually going to switch to another demo at this point. This is the weather forecast. So this one for me is super exciting because the addition of data types and all these new features that we've added to the calculation of engine in Excel. Obviously, Python is one of those new things, but what happens when we take all these big concepts we've been talking about for the past 3 to 5 years and we combine them into one? And so for me, this is like the prime example where I can do all those things. I can mash all this stuff together and not just do analysis in Python, but I can actually use Excel for what it's good for and the new things that we've added that would just completely be impossible before. So I geek out a little bit on this one, but let's go ahead and get started. So I'm not going to talk too much about all the code that I wrote here. We wrote the code ahead of time. I'm doing some historical data analysis. I'll talk a little bit about what's going on in here, but I really want to focus on how stuff can kind of just interweave itself within the new vision that we have for Excel and the future of Calc. So we've got some historical data here. And this historical data I've generated ahead of time. And so what we've got are 4 different columns. There's temperature, humidity, wind speed, and then a forecast. And so we want to forecast the weather for the next 5 days in this scenario. We could do it for whatever amount of days we have data for. So you can see I've made this table 5 rows big. I could make it 10, 20, 100, whatever it is I want to forecast. But this is my historical data. And so we can see these different portions of information. Now with that, we also have a forecast for the future. We know that for the next 5 days, the temperature is going to be this, the humidity is going to be this, and the wind speed is this. What we're going to forecast is this bit on, that's actually just called forecast, but that's kind of what's the weather like? Is it going to be rainy, sunny, cloudy? In this case, we've only got rainy and sunny days, but let's see what happens when we build our analysis. So that's the data that's backing this right now. The other thing that comes out of this is within Python, you can associate different labels for different characteristics of your data. And so what I've done here is I've encoded some data that says, here's the weather type, so cloudy, rainy, or sunny, and then this maps to a numerical series, and then I can mash those things together and build out a model, which is exactly what I do here, and then I'm able to predict the weather from this. So if I click here, you can see that I've got the 5 days that I have of predicted weather, and we've got sunny and cloudy mostly. But I can also merge this, which is what's done in this cell, and create a full forecast. So I can combine the 2 sets of data that I've got within Python and mash them together and create a data frame of that information. And so here we can see all that information. I've got kind of like a tile view down here. And what I want to do is bring this over and actually pull in information. So I can just use normal Excel functions, since these are data types, and do normal Excel behaviors that might have been difficult before. So I'm going to reference the full forecast in this case, and I'm actually going to use dot notation to pull out the array preview. Now, I wouldn't always recommend using array preview because it is a preview, but in this case, I know that I've got 5 cells of data, so the preview is always going to be the full thing. Part of this is me just shortcutting, pulling that out and extracting the whole thing, but I can do it in one go here. So if I do that, it's just going to simply transpose that data that we saw here. And so now we're totally in Excel world. Python did its bit. It did the modeling for us. Now we've got everything in Excel. So that's cool. When I talk about that data types journey, we just took a data type. We used something also newer, a dynamic array, and then we can just transpose that whole thing and bring it into Excel. And that brings me to the second point, which you might be wondering, what are these individual cells for? So for this, I actually want to generate, like you might be used to in looking at weather apps, kind of a picture of what that weather is going to be. We can see it down here, but it would be great to have a picture. So to do that, I'm actually going to use a lambda, because I think this is a great example of where, again, you can mash these worlds together and just highlights all the improvements we've been making to Excel. And to do that, I'm going to use something called Excel Labs. So another plug, if you aren't familiar with Excel Labs, I'm going to show you real quick just what it's about. But you can get it from the Office add-in store. So if you go into your app and look for add-ins, it's available on the Office add-in store. Now, Excel Labs is pretty cool because this is a place where we're bringing new and experimental features to Excel. And part of that's because we want to experiment without having to necessarily dedicate all the resources to putting it in the product first. This allows us to learn, allows us to get feedback from you guys and figure out what does and doesn't work. And so we actually have 2 features in here that I'm highlighting today. The first is something called the Advanced Formula Environment. This is cool because it brings the concepts of programming IDEs into Excel. So if you've ever written a mega formula, this is maybe beneficial to you if you end up using it. The other bit is something called the labs.generative AI function. So we announced this a couple months ago, but I wish I could demo it today. I haven't built anything around it. Definitely go try this out and see what you can do if you mash Excel with this function, with all the new stuff we've done, but this basically allows you to connect to the different language models, and you can do things like ask it a question or tell it to write a joke for you or whatever's interesting or useful. So moving along, I'm going to open advanced formula environment, and you'll notice we're greeted with a different view of our spreadsheet. You'll also notice that there's nothing here, and that's because this is an editor for this cell. So I don't actually have any content here, so there's nothing for me to show. What I will direct your attention to, though, is the names here. And this is where I've gone ahead and created a named lambda. And so if you aren't familiar with lambdas, the idea is that you can encapsulate custom functions using Excel's native language, the Excel formula language. And so within this, I've got a lambda that generates a weather strip for me, which is perfect for the scenario we're talking through. If I click this button, I can edit it. You'll notice we have a function named weather strip, and the thing that it takes is a forecast. Now I know ahead of time that the shape of my data, and so it's expecting a little bit of that data. But I really wanted to highlight what's going on here because this kind of mashes together all those improvements we've been making to Excel. So the first thing I do is I pull in that forecast, and then I pull out the array preview from it so that I can get the weather strip information. The second thing I do is use our new image function. This is pretty cool because now I can actually return an image to Excel. And so what's going on here is I have different images, either sunny, cloudy, or rainy, and I'm going to use those in a second with the map function. Map function is another function inside of Excel we added with lambdas. It might seem a little daunting at first, but the concept I feel is rather simple. If you have an array of stuff and you want to go through it and you want to say for an individual value, return something different or transform it, that's where map is good. And so we're using it here to pull in our forecast. And then basically we're checking, did I get the word cloudy? Okay, return a cloudy image. Did I get sunny? Return sunny, rainy, so on and so forth. So all that is just to demonstrate a little bit about how we're going to use a lambda here. So I'm going to hit done. And if I want, I can use actually that grid editor to show you a little bit how that works. So in this case, I'll just type equals like I normally would, and I'm going to reference my weather strip. And it's one simple function that takes one simple bit of data. And in this case, I actually want to return cell B7 because I just want the strip of information around sunny or cloudy. So I've referenced that information, hit enter, and just like that, I've been able to build a completely modular spreadsheet that allows me to show kind of the forecast of the weather. And what's cool is now generally I did generate all this data myself. So if we wanted to, we can just sit here and I can mash F9 and we can generate new sequences of data. So in the real world, you can imagine if you were trying to forecast data, all you have to do is get a new dump, get a recalc of it, and then your analysis is complete. So hopefully this highlights a little bit about how the world of data types and Python and all this new improvements we've been making to Excel Calc are coming together. I'm actually going to minimize this one to go on to the last bit of analysis that I have, which highlights another feature that we feel like Python's pretty good at, and that is for doing extraction and formatting of dates or just general data cleaning tasks. So what's going on here? Again, I've pre-written this code ahead of time, so we're not going to do live coding, but I will explain what's going on. So what I've done here is I'm actually using a function that I defined over here in this imports tab that I created. So what I will highlight here is this is a rather long function. So the intent of what it's doing, though, is we're actually using regular expressions to take in a bunch of dates and then extract those and then format them. This is something that's pretty cool to do because now if you're familiar with regular expressions, and if you aren't, I would definitely suggest going out to the web because there's a lot of really neat tools that can actually generate regular expressions for you off of prompts. But having said that, I can just take these regular expressions, iterate through all of them, and then produce some results that extract dates. And I'm doing that all from within Python. And the last thing I guess I wanted to highlight was I'm actually defining a function here. So this is kind of I guess a pro tip for any of you just dipping your toes in this world. I personally like to define a lot of the things that I'm doing as functions, and then that way I can go to other cells inside of Python and I can define them and call them later. And so that's what we'll do here. All right. So all this cell is doing is I'm using it to just kind of show you guys that we've got a function here. And so we've got extract and format dates. This is the function. You'll notice that it returns a function data type. Again, this is another example of where the different Python outputs I think are useful from what we have, because if I were to do something like Excel value, you'll see I get a £NA because Excel doesn't know what to do with that. So we're just going to return this as a Python object. Now the data that I have, you can kind of see below, but I've actually imported that as an array, and so I've got that here. And then to do this analysis, all I'm going to do is reference Python again and simply pull in the function that I wrote ahead of time. And so you can actually see autocomplete kicking in here, which is nice. So I'll just tab through that. And then what do I want to do? Well, I need to pass in some data. So I've got my data. I'll click on this cell, cell B5. Commit this, and we get our data frame back, which should have our formatted information. It does. And I'll switch this over, and now we've got our formatted text. And then I can even do a count, which I've done down here, of all the different bits of text that's been pulled out. So that kind of highlights everything that I wanted to go through today. Hopefully these were some interesting and novel demos, and you've learned a little bit, as well as if you've been watching our blog post, learned a little bit about how we created these things.